In terms of caliber names, there's perhaps one designation that always piques people's interest, that designation being .50, and this is undoubtedly due to the fact that nearly all 50 caliber munitions are by default big. I mean, the only one that really comes to mind as being small, at least when I see it, is 50 caliber round balls, though to be fair, it is fairly small when shooting other muzzle-loading calibers, and I myself have shot quite a fair bit of 50 caliber mini balls, which, while large, are kind of deceptive when it comes to size, given the skirt, but anyways, back to what we were saying, a 50 caliber tends to be just big. So it should come as no surprise that chambering a common weapon famous for having rather small cartridges is definitely going to turn some heads. What's up guys, Scipio here, and welcome back to another Cartridge Week episode, this week featuring the popular and extra large 50 Beowulf. Now before we get into the history, use, and all that stuff on this very popular, or at least popular by name caliber, we will first do what we always do and take a look at the Headstamp, which on the top we can see a star, signifying this particular example used Starline brass for the casing. Now this is likely an Underwood ammo loaded cartridge, as they tend to use Starline brass for a lot of their new production ammo. In particular, I'm pretty sure this is one of their 350 grain XTP jacketed hollow point loadings. Then on the bottom we can see 12.7 by 42 millimeter for the caliber, and this is actually a very common way you will see this cartridge labeled, given Alexander Arms has a patent on the name 50 Beowulf. So everyone else tends to use the metric designations for the caliber, and on the boxes of ammo you will still see 50 Beowulf, however it's usually preceded by something like Designed for Firearms In. That way they can avoid confusion with the metric name and at the same time not get sued. I absolutely love it when we have to go through all these loopholes just because of a simple name. Anyways, the 50 Beowulf was born from Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Cooper's Thumper concept, essentially a semi-automatic in a caliber no less in diameter than 44. Now, there was a little more to this concept, like having the guns be small and compact in size, and a few other things. However, in relation to the caliber, the semi-automatic in a large bore cartridge was the main source of inspiration for a variety of Thumper cartridges that would come out in the very early 2000s, with the 50 Beowulf being one of the first to hit the market in 2001. The cartridge was designed using a 50 Action Express casing that was lengthened to the max length that would allow it to properly fit inside of an AR magazine. Now, though this allows for more powder, the stretching of the case was mainly done for better reliability when using 5.56 magazines, as throwing a 50 Action Express in one leaves you with a lot of space for the cartridge to bounce back and forth, which would of course ultimately lead to a lot of feeding issues. Now, one thing that you've likely noticed is with the 50 Beowulf, the rim is a lot smaller than the casing. This is what's called a rebated rim. And the 50 Action Express that the Beowulf derives its casing from also features a rebated rim, the size specifically matching the rim of the 44 Magnum. However, the rim on the 50 Beowulf has been further shrunk down to match that of the 6.5 Grendel, and this was done as Bill Alexander of Alexander Arms, or the guy who developed the caliber, had plenty of 6.5 Grendel bolt heads laying around, so it prevented him from having to go and design and produce a whole new bolt head for a 44 Magnum diameter rim. Another important design aspect of the 50 Beowulf was keeping the pressures within a safe range so as to allow for the usage of a standard weighted buffer assembly, as well as just perform in your standard run-of-the-mill AR. Now this meant that the caliber isn't necessarily loaded to its absolute max. Side note, actually, a very good comparisons with the 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum. Both cartridges feature an extremely similar casing in terms of both length and width. However, the 50 Beowulf is spec'd for a max pressure of 33,000 psi, whereas the 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum is spec'd to a max almost double that at 60,000 psi. Now, one big thing that you guys have probably already assumed by now at this point is that the 50 Beowulf was designed to require as few caliber-specific parts as possible. And with the 50, the only parts you need that are specific to the caliber are a different barrel and an upper receiver that features a wider ejection port, as the ejection port on a normal AR is much too small to allow for the ejection of the much wider casings. And right now they sell the upper receivers that, they have this wider opening, but when the prototypes of the new gun were being made, they obviously had to cut away some metal from the ejection port themselves. Now, one thing you may see when looking into AR's chamber for this cartridge is magazines made specifically for the 50 Beowulf, or rather they're made for the big bore cartridge family in general. Like these ones right here will also work for 458 SOCOM as well. Now, I think a big reason for these magazines is mag capacity restrictions in certain states, as though a 30 round 5.56 mag will only hold 10 of these large rounds, it also holds 30 rounds of 5.56, meaning that some people may not be able to get their hands on one in one of those mag-restricted states. However, that being said, I do often see these large bore-specific magazines being touted as being much more reliable than standard unmodified 5.56 mags. Now, I don't own a 50 Beowulf, but I do own a 458 SOCOM, which has the exact same case dimensions below the bottleneck. And I'll say that I haven't had any mag-related issues that having a special follower for the larger cartridge would have fixed. The problems actually seem to come from flexibility with plastic magazines. Now, standard Stanag mags, those worked perfectly fine. Absolutely no issues whatsoever with those, which back in the day when they were developing the card, like the 50 Beowulf and the 458 SOCOM and all that, that's pretty much the magazines they would have been using. And this includes like cheap Turkish copy mags, all the way up to just standard run-of-the-mill P mags. But the problem that I do get with plastic mags is as I go to load more and more rounds, and with this cartridge being slightly smaller than the interior of the magazine, it begins to open up these feed lips. Now, the first issue that you'll get is sometimes the magazine will just not want to go inside the gun because these are a bit expanded. The second, which can happen right when you seat the magazine or just during firing of the rounds, is the cartridge is actually just popping up and out of the magazine. Now, again, this seems to be only something that I've experienced with plastic mags. The good old metal Stanag mags run just fine without any sort of hitch. This issue is probably solved with one of those big bore specific polymer mags too. Perhaps they do address these issues, but for all intensive purposes, you don't necessarily need those specific magazines for the caliber if you have standard Stanag mags laying around, which, as stated at the time of this cartridge development and release, that was the vast majority of AR magazines on the market. Now, we had mentioned earlier that the initial inspiration for the creation of this cartridge was the Thumper concept, the whole big bore semi-automatic compact rifle. However, there was a little bit more purpose than simply that. The idea for the cartridge was for niche applications that the inventor figured would better favor a big bore cartridge. The one that I'm always seeing is as a vehicle checkpoint guard gun, as a caliber like this will more than certainly not be bothered with, say, shooting through glass, and a common claim you will see is that they are highly effective at taking out engine blocks. Now, interestingly enough, with a cool claim like that, you would expect to see someone have, tried that out. I personally couldn't find any videos of someone making an engine stop with one of these. I think depending on range, distance, and all that, it is kind of doubtful, and it's more just the selling point to try to sell the cartridge. Probably possible. I think it's funny that the only thing I saw was a page that wouldn't load, and it was about a guy shooting out golf cart engine blocks. So do with that information what you will. Maybe there is a video or test, and I just didn't see it, but just kind of funny. Another niche application you'll see this cartridge suggested for, at least, is for use in close quarters fightings as sort of a stopping rifle, with its massive size being touted as something with way more stopping power than a 5.56. Now, regardless of whether or not that's actually true, it is something that you will often see claimed about the 50 Beowulf. So with that in mind, what is the caliber actually used mostly for nowadays? Well, despite nearly every single website you read about this cartridge making some grandiose claims of it being a caliber for militaries, law enforcement, and all that, the main use this cartridge sees is as either a range toy or as a hunting caliber. Now, I imagine that maybe some private contractors have used this caliber, or perhaps some special forces may have tried it out at least once. I mean, they definitely tried out weirder stuff. However, when it comes to any sort of military or police use, I honestly cannot find a single reliable source that ever shows this cartridge being used in military, security, police, what have you. It does appear that the majority of use this cartridge gets is, as mentioned, a range toy and for hunting, with the main selling point for the caliber being it's a 50 caliber AR. Now, I would argue that the vast majority of people that purchase a 50 Beowulf, even the ones that intend to use it for hunting, do so because, again, it's a 50 caliber AR. However, with that being said, to say it's an impractical caliber, like you'll often see said, is definitely far from the truth. For hunting purposes, it certainly does the job, and using straight-walled casings allows for it to be used in certain states. It may possess restrictions on usage of bottlenecked cartridges for hunting. Now, as we had mentioned earlier, this caliber is popular mostly by name. This definitely is in large part due to ammo cost, as although it's cool to own said 50 caliber AR, the ammo doesn't pay for itself, and with cost per round tending to float around the $2 range. Of course, you can and honestly really should reload for this caliber should you choose to get a gun in it, and that does drive the cost per round down significantly. To add to that, as with other rounds like 450 Bushmaster and 458 SOCOM, the casings have a fairly long life, meaning that should you always make sure to keep an eye on your brass, then bullets, primers, and powder will really be your only concern. So with all that being said, what exactly are the specs on this thing? Well, on average, we're looking at a 300 to 400 grain bullet with a velocity of around 1,870 feet per second on the lighter one and 1,800 feet per second on the heavier one. Now, with that said, I have seen lighter bullets in the 200 grain range, featuring one of those polymer copper mixed bullets, and the heaviest loadings I've seen are actually a 600 grain hard cast. But anyways, I think that is going to do it for this week's Cards of the Week episode featuring the 50 Beowulf. I hope y'all enjoyed the video as much as I personally enjoyed making it, and I will see y'all next time.